Society is riddled with activities to help us press our pleasure button. Pornography, junk food, recreational drugs, television, video games, prostitution, soda pop, candy, etc. This is a picture of a mouse that's had an electrode implanted in its brain in its pleasure center. There's a lever on the wall next to the mouse, and every time he pushes the lever, it works like a switch to activate his pleasure center and get him high. So we could call this lever a pleasure button. And basically our little mousy friend is going to sit here and continue to press that lever over and over and over. He will even pee on himself and he doesn't care. He will just keep on pressing his pleasure button. But here's what's innately wrong with our little mousy friend continually pressing his pleasure button. When he presses the pleasure button, there's no real survival that's actually obtained. So he's kind of getting the reward without the accomplishment. It's a type of short-circuiting or cheating. And in these experiments where an animal has an electrode placed on his pleasure center, they actually find that the animal becomes addicted to pressing that pleasure button and will lose interest in everything else, including his actual survival. In some experiments, the animals have even been found to stop eating completely. The animal becomes so obsessed with pushing its pleasure button that it will just stop eating and eventually starve to death, even though it has food right next to it. Because the amount of pleasure that's sent to the animal's brain every time it pushes that pleasure button is actually a greater quantity of pleasure than it gets from the act of eating, it loses its motivation to eat and will eventually starve to death. So here's a perfect situation where we have pleasure without the accomplishment of survival. The animal becomes a push-button pleasure zombie who will do nothing else. The gravitation toward pleasure and repulsion from pain seems to have evolved to motivate survival. It seems that nature intended for pleasure to be a reward of activities that enhance our survival, and that pain is kind of a penalty for activities that cause harm or that are probably not going to help our survival. So people don't jump off cliffs because it hurts. And activities that do enhance our survival are actually rewarded by and motivated by pleasure, things like eating and having sex. As soon as pleasure is no longer associated with survival activities like eating, we have a pretty serious problem. On an evolutionary level, pleasure is a motivating factor for survival activities. And when we dissociate pleasure and survival, then pleasure becomes its own reward, and even becomes more important than survival itself. In experiments like these, research psychiatrists are literally exploiting the animal's natural drive for pleasure to the point of the animal's eventual death. And I just want to point out that aside from being a huge animal rights violation, this is also an unnatural exploitation, where the research scientist is actually, through physical intervention, going in and changing the animal's body so that it will be motivated by pleasure and not by its own survival. And if that scientist had just left that little mousey alone, he might still be alive today. So why on earth would somebody be doing experiments like this in the first place? You might think this is kind of an isolated incident, but actually this is a fairly common research study. They've done studies like this on guinea pigs, mice, dogs, monkeys, and even humans. In fact, this very experiment was part of the CIA mind control experiments, MKUltra, where they were looking to see how they could control people's behavior by manipulating the pleasure center of the brain. Now, it really goes without saying that people are motivated by pleasure. And I'm sure you can think of things that you do or that other people do simply for the pleasure. But here's what I'm going to ask and what I want you to take an honest look at. How many common sources of pleasure are there in society that are actually devoid of any survival benefit, or that maybe even hurt our potential survival? In other words, what are the different ways that people press their pleasure button without achieving any survival benefits? From an entrepreneur, business person, or marketing perspective, people desire pleasure. And if you can give them something that will give them some pleasure, then people will pay you money for it. And society has a huge amount of people that are pleasure brokers, who specialize in giving people pleasure or giving people a product that will help them press their own pleasure button. And there's a word for this. It's called pandering. According to the Collins English Dictionary, to pander is to give gratification to weaknesses or desires. Traditionally, pandering has been used to describe prostitution, where the pimp is the panderer, and he's the pleasure broker who, for a nominal fee, gives the person the opportunity to press his pleasure button. But one of the main things I want to point out is that society is full of pleasurable activities with no survival benefit, or even with a survival harm. So soda pop is a great example, because the only reason that somebody's going to drink a sugar-sweetened carbonated beverage is because all that high fructose corn syrup and caffeine are gonna help to push your pleasure button. Now, if you've watched any of our videos, you know that we love to rag on soda because it has zero health benefits and it's been correlated with weight gain, diabetes, obesity, and tooth decay. But people love to push their pleasure button so much that soda pop is actually the #1 most sold item in American grocery stores. Human intelligence and modern technology have enabled humans to come up with a whole lot of pleasurable activities. Things like cigarette smoking and alcohol, which help us to push our pleasure button with no help to our survival. And just like the mouse who's sitting there pushing his pleasure button, he's a push-button pleasure zombie and he forgets about everything else except pushing his pleasure button. And we have lots of activities that help us push our pleasure button. And what's really the difference between our little mousy friend sitting there pushing his pleasure button or us sitting there pushing our pleasure button by watching TV or playing hours of video games or watching hours of pornography? Human beings have also been smart enough to learn that they could intensify their pleasure by pressing the pleasure button harder or faster. And whenever the pleasure survival reward mechanism is being exploited, such as the case with the mouse who loses interest in eating, people also lose their motivation for doing survival activities. A crystal meth user, for example, will continue using that drug even though it's destroying his body from the inside, even though his hair, his teeth are rotting out, and he feels paranoid all the time. The pleasure button just cannot be resisted. Psychological experiments involving stimulating an animal's pleasure center have also demonstrated that an animal is willing to endure pain by running across an electrified floor in order to get to its pleasure button. And this demonstrates that the desire for pleasure is actually a stronger motivator than the desire to avoid pain. And this is scary because it shows that animals and people will engage in self-destructive or even painful behaviors if there's enough pleasure associated with it. And this is fairly common. I mean, how many people do you know that will go out for a night of partying, drink until they puke all over themselves, wake up the next day with a horrible hangover, and still say that they had a great time and go out and do the same thing the next night? As Admiral Akbar would say, it's a trap. Our modern society is booby-trapped on all sides with inexpensive push-button pleasures on every single corner. Now, it's really astounding to me how much the food industry exploits this push-button pleasure mechanism. And a great example is refined sugar. Because people don't eat donuts and drink soda pop and eat McDonald's French fries for the health benefits or to maintain their figure. These are foods that people consume simply to push their pleasure button, and these push-button pleasure foods are becoming so common and so accepted in our society that they're even sold in elementary school vending machines. And then we wonder why our obesity rates are reaching epidemic proportions. pandering and the general exploitation of our pleasure survival reward mechanism is a huge problem in our society. It's the basic mechanism that underlies addiction, and certain push-button pleasures can even ruin people's lives. The obese person that can't give up junk food and soda pop, the students with poor grades who stay up all night playing video games, the alcoholic, the recreational drug user, the porn addiction that costs someone their marriage, the cigarette smoker who ends up with lung cancer, or the promiscuous person who winds up with herpes or even HIV. Now, I'm not saying that pleasure is a bad thing. It's just the dissociation from pleasure and survival that can be potentially dangerous. And it really is a trap that can ultimately undermine your survival. But for you as an individual, you have a choice. Are you going to be the push-button pleasure zombie mouse that eventually starves itself to death? Or do you want to survive? You will survive to the degree that you engage in pleasurable activities that also enable your survival. And you will survive to the degree that you can avoid these push-button pleasure activities that do not help to enhance survival, and especially the ones that hurt your ultimate survival. So be wise about your pleasure, live long, and prosper. One way that the food industry exploits our pleasure button is with the use of excitotoxins, things like MSG or monosodium glutamate, which actually go in and stimulate the reward center in your brain to help encourage you to keep eating more of that food. So be sure to subscribe for that future video. Now, I'm not telling you that you have to live a life devoid of pleasure and that you can't enjoy yourself anymore. And in a future video, I'm actually going to count down the top pleasure button activities that are also going to enhance your survival as well. I really hope that you liked my video. And if you did, I hope that you'll press my pleasure button, the like button down here in the corner. I hope you'll subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends, and be sure to friend Psyche Truth on Facebook.